Hi, my name is Caroline Gaylor, and I'm the Director of Development at MGFA. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shruti Raja. Dr. Raja is a board-certified neurologist working at Duke Health in North Carolina. She focuses on a holistic approach, so she doesn't just focus on the treatment of the disease, but also the way the disease is affecting the rest of the patient's life and quality of life. Dr. Raja's research emphasizes the development of new therapies and outcome measures for autoimmune neuromuscular conditions that include disorders of neuromuscular transmission. Dr. Raja served on the steering committee for MGFA's scientific session this year and will take over as chair for next year's meeting. Dr. Raja will be speaking today on how to decide if a clinical trial is right for you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So, as noted, this talk is going to focus on why, as a patient, you should consider joining a clinical trial. So, I've left plenty of time for questions at the end, so if you have any questions, just pop them into the Q&A and we'll address them at the end. So for disclosure, I am a recipient of I do receive research support from the MGFA, and I'm also a consultant on MG-related outcome measures for Signet Health as well as Regeneron. So as a starting point, just want to give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. So one is to kind of review what is a clinical trial, and what are different types of clinical trials, why it's important to join a clinical trial or what considerations there are. There's benefits, there's also potentially some barriers. Other really key question is, what do I ask my provider, my MG provider? And then looking at this from a big picture, how does my decision to participate in a clinical trial affect the wider MG community? So as a kind of kickoff, let's define what is a clinical trial. So I like to think of a clinical trial as any opportunity to really assess the effect of a treatment. And clinical trials can answer questions relating to the safety, the dosing, as well as whether or not the outcome measures that we're using to assess response are really good at doing that. And so typically clinical trials will consist of an active treatment as well as some sort of control or a placebo, which it will essentially be a group where the actual drug or intervention is not given. And in most clinical trials, at least initially, the treatment assignments are not known by the patient or the provider. And the ultimate goal of this is to determine in an unbiased manner whether or not any new treatment or intervention benefits a specific population, in this case, individuals with MG. So the question ultimately becomes, why should I join? And the answer is that right now, there's really limited options for treatment of myasthenia in the sense that we only have 3 approved drugs, and most of the treatments that are used for myasthenia are actually off-label, but we use them because they have a good track record of benefit. And so with the development of new drugs, which right now is actually in its heyday, there's about 5 or 6 drugs that are in development right now for myasthenia at various stages, is to determine theoretically, there's to determine if the theoretical mechanism of action actually translates to a real benefit in outcomes and in control of disease. And so the way that I like to think about this is that participation in clinical trials increases knowledge about the disease as well as the different therapeutics. And so they help us to develop better treatments, and having better treatments for myasthenia ultimately improves quality of life for all individuals with myasthenia. So one of the challenges with myasthenia is that myasthenia is considered a rare disease. And so there's not as many patients, and clinical trials tend to be smaller. If you think about this, there's probably about 60,000 myasthenics in the US, and For comparison, there's millions of diabetics or millions of individuals with hypertension. Other kind of challenge with MG is that no two patients are alike. Everyone's symptoms are a little bit different, but they ultimately will arise from similar pathologies. And so the question becomes, what really matters? How do we know that the disease is progressing or that it's improving? And then what kind of benefit are patients actually looking for? So we keep in mind also that, this is geographically, patients and research sites are not always near each other. The good news about that is that there's an increasing use of telehealth for conduct of study visits, as well as options for home visits. Other kind of thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the larger kind of phase 2-3 clinical trials will help to provide some stipend for travel expenses, which can often make it a little bit easier for a participant to get there. And so the idea here is that whatever we can do to increase the number of participants, we get more of an opportunity to see a difference. And we also get more opportunities to look at specific groups of MG patients. So MG patients who have specific characteristics, whether that be that they have a particular distribution of disease, a particular antibody, a particular aspect of daily living that is most problematic. And we can subcategorize patients based on this. So one of the things that's often helpful to understand about a clinical trial is, what is the general process for this? And so the way that I've broken this down is to focus on, okay, if this is a clinical trial for a new therapy, typically you're going to start with a screening visit. So this is going to be a visit where you'll meet with the provider and meet with the research team to determine whether or not you meet the specific disease criteria as well as health criteria for participation. Then, if one is determined to be eligible, there will be study visits. And these visits can be for receipt of the drug or intervention, or they can be for assessments, or oftentimes both are involved in the visits. The key here is that the visits occur at variable frequency depending on which specific treatment is being evaluated. So these could be as often as every week to as infrequent as every 1 to 2 months. Likewise, there will be visits at the end of treatment, and so these will mark the end of participation in a clinical trial or in a particular section of a clinical trial. And then oftentimes following the clinical trial, if there is a clear benefit, then patients can roll over into what's called an open label extension. So this is an opportunity to actually receive the drug and know that you're receiving the drug. As a patient, it's really important to be aware of the fact that there is ongoing research in myasthenia, and to always ask about new treatments and trials when you see your provider. And it's okay if your provider doesn't know off the top of his or her head what's going on. There are other resources that you can access to get this information. There's a government-maintained database of clinical trials that's accessible to everybody at clinicaltrials.gov. And then the MGFA also has a number of different research studies that they'll post information about, so clinical trials in particular. And the way you get to this is from the MGFA homepage. If you click on the little research tab and then clinical trials, you'll get a whole list of active clinical trials that are MG focused. So now, we have a trial that's going on and I'm potentially a candidate. So you always want to think about what's the next step. So this sort of takes us back to our basics. Who is the investigator? where is the trial being conducted? Is it somewhere close to you or is it somewhere far from you? What exactly is the treatment or the intervention and how does it work? And then the other question to always think about is asking, why would I be a good candidate for this trial? And if that basic set of questions piques your interest, then the next step is to go one layer closer and find out more details about the trial itself. And a lot of these details can actually be found on that clinicaltrials.gov website that I pointed out earlier. So they will tell you about what is the duration of the participation, how often are the visits, what potentially would happen, what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are. And so one of the common questions that comes up is, I'm already on a number of therapies. Will I be able to continue those and still be part of the trial? Or what happens if I join the trial and I'm not doing well on the new treatment? Is there an opportunity to get out of the trial, or is there an opportunity for any kind of rescue from the trial? Likewise, also important is to know, is the trial a placebo-controlled trial where one group of individuals may receive the intervention and the other may not? And is there ever going to be an opportunity to potentially get the actual active therapy? Likewise, when will the trial end? Usually these trials will go on for several years because enrollment will occur on a rolling basis. And then other really important question to ask is, when will the results be shared? What's the expectation and how will they be shared? Because ultimately the goal of doing clinical trials in myasthenia is to learn more about whether or not a particular therapy works and then to share that information with the community. And so one of the questions that I am often asked is whether or not, as a patient, I should join a clinical trial because there may not be a direct benefit to me. And so what I wanted to present is the perspective of one patient who's been a myasthenic for over 35 years and has seen the evolution of the landscape of myasthenia clinical trials as well as myasthenia research and been through a number of different therapies along the way. And so one of the key ideas is that even if there's no direct benefit to one individual, that participation in a clinical trial is about improving quality of life for everybody with myasthenia. And to maintain that hope that there is something that will help out. And if we think about this in terms of other patient organizations, the more that we're involved as patients and as providers, the more information we will learn. And the ultimate idea is that, even if you don't get the actual treatment intervention, that's still an important part of the study because it allows us to determine whether or not this is something that may be of benefit. If we don't have a comparator group, then we have no way to assess for evidence of a benefit. Likewise, there are bigger implications for the community in terms of everyone participating in research. More participation means more research and a greater likelihood of finding a cure or a benefit. So this goes back to those flow charts I showed before, where participation is leading to knowledge, which is leading to better treatments and an improved quality of life. So if you think about it this way, if you have more participants, you have a greater likelihood of seeing a difference. And you also have more opportunities to look at specific subgroups of MG patients. So, for example, those who have ocular disease, those who have generalized disease, those who have acetylcholine receptor antibodies, those who do not, those who have MuSK antibodies. There's a number of different subgroups that can be assessed. And unless you have sufficient participation from each of them, you may never know the answer. Finally, it's important to bear in mind that there are research opportunities beyond interventional trials. And these can be things like registry-based studies to look at natural history, studies to assess different outcomes, studies to look at different quality of life measures. Also biomarker studies, so looking at specific markers within the blood or within cells for differences in different types of treatment. And then the new other area that is now starting to become more vogue, if you will, is to see are there differences at a genetic level between patients that dictate how they respond to different therapies. And so all of these, even if these are not trials that have a particular intervention in them, but they tell us a lot about the disease and the disease process. And so as a closing thought, I want to leave you with this quote from the popular author Nora Roberts. If you don't go after what you want, you'll never have it. If you don't ask, the answer is always no. And if you don't step forward, you're always in the same place. So whenever you're presented with a clinical trial opportunity or a research opportunity, think about this quotation and think about what is your goal? What is your goal in this disease and in your life? And how does participation change that? So I'm going to leave it here for discussion. If you have questions, Dova's going to take the lead on them, or at least introduce them.
Okay, thank you very much. The first question is, how are the participation criteria developed?
So typically the participation criteria are developed based on the specific characteristics of the drug itself, as well as what might be safety concerns that have been identified during prior studies of the drug. So it's very specific to each product or each specific drug, usually determined by the mechanism of action, as well as what's been observed in safety studies. As an example, most myasthenia trials are aware of the fact that patients may have other underlying conditions. And so they don't exclude patients who have other underlying conditions, for example, diabetes or hypertension, but they'll request that those conditions be under control before a patient would enter a trial.
Great, thank you. If you benefit from, I think you covered this in your talk, but let's answer the question anyway. If you benefit from a drug when part of a trial, can you stay on the drug afterwards?
This is really going to depend on how the clinical trial has been set up and what the sponsor of the clinical trial has determined. Many clinical trials will have what's called an open label extension, where they will continue to have the drug available through the sponsor as part of ongoing clinical research until the drug receives approval. And those programs can go on for an undetermined period of time, but the key is that there's some continued assessment of response during them. Not all trials offer this particular feature, but it is one of the features that is encouraged by investigators, particularly because for patients who are noting a difference, it can be a big difference.
Thank you. The next question is, what is in the placebo? Some are liquids and some are solids, depending on the trial.
That's a great question.
What are they taking when they take a placebo?
When they take a placebo, right. So that's a really great question. And that's really determined by what the exact type of drug product is, what it is. If it's an infusion, for example, then typically it will be an infusion that has all of the same components as the drug minus the active drug. So it looks the same and it's given in the exact same manner. The only difference is it's missing that one active ingredient. If it's something like a tablet, then it's very similar again. You will have a tablet or capsule that's prepared that contains all of the same ingredients minus the active ingredient. So that way it's not entirely clear during the trial, if it's a blinded trial where neither the participant nor the investigator is aware of what is being given, that there's no difference between the two. The only difference is that one has the active product and one doesn't.
Got it. Thank you. If I want to participate in a trial and my doctor's office is not doing the trial, how do I talk to my doctor about getting into the trial and leaving the practice, or he or she won't be treating me anymore?
But this can be a tough question because, in general, most of the myasthenia trials tend to be done at centers that treat more myasthenia. And I would say that it's not necessarily a reason to break your relationship with your existing provider, but your existing provider needs to be aware of the fact that you are participating in a clinical trial and would need to work with a clinical trial physician, especially if there's going to be any changes or considerations in your therapy or if there's an issue along the way. So I would say it's not completely breaking a relationship, it's adding in a new partner in care.
Great, thank you. If we are stable and on current medications, should we sign up for a clinical trial?
So that's going to depend on the type of clinical trial. Most clinical trials require that an individual have a certain degree of symptoms in order or score a certain amount on specific MG assessments. So what I would say is that it may not be necessarily that you're eligible for an interventional trial, but you could be eligible for some of these non-trial research opportunities, like a natural history study or a study to look at biomarkers, things like that. And some trials will also, I don't see this as often because there is a danger in taking a patient who's myasthenic off of medications when they're stable. So typically, trials don't include patients who are stable because there's also very little opportunity to see a change.
So the next question is, again, how do I sign up or how do I find out about opportunities? I think it's worth repeating that to explain how people sign up or find out about them.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different options. Let me pull that slide back up. So there's a lot of different non-trial opportunities, and many of these are often registered on clinicaltrials.gov. The other way that you can find out about a lot of these is through MGFA, because many of the investigators for these non-trial and other research opportunities are collaborating with the MGFA, and that website that I showed before for MGFA research does also have information about non-clinical trial opportunities.
The next question is, unfortunately for seronegative patients, it is exclusionary. Do you foresee that changing in the future?
We are now seeing a lot more trials allowing enrollment of seronegative patients. Usually it's not in the earliest stages of the clinical trials, but I do see that changing. And the reason I see that changing is because as we learn more about seronegative myasthenia, we're getting a better understanding of how to target it and what the different mechanisms underlying it are. So I wouldn't lose hope for increased opportunity to participate in trials.
What types of things disqualify a patient from a trial?
So typically things that would disqualify a patient from a clinical trial would be unstable chronic medical conditions. So for example, uncontrolled diabetes, uncontrolled blood pressure. Most clinical trials have some specific safety lab requirements as well. So if somebody is overly anemic or has impaired renal function, that may figure in, so impaired kidney function, that would also be a safety concern depending on how the drug is metabolized. And so it's really variable for each clinical trial, and it's kind of customized to what the safety risks of the specific product are.
Okay, thank you. This question is, are there any new trials that you know of on double vision that cannot be controlled with other drugs?
I'm not particularly aware of any, but what I would say is that there are other interventions for double vision that can't be controlled with drugs that are worth exploring, that are less, that don't involve a drug and that could still make an impact. So I have in many cases recommended patients work with a neuro-ophthalmologist to determine if there is any benefit to using prisms in the lenses. Or if the double vision is stable, for some patients, surgical intervention may also be an option. So I think the key is to talk to your provider to determine if that double vision is really due to the myasthenia or is it due to something else, and what might be the options.
Great, thank you. Members of my community do not believe in clinical trials. How do I encourage my family to participate or understand my participation in clinical research?
So this can be a really delicate discussion and can often be a very sensitive subject because it is, being in a clinical trial or participating in research requires a certain amount of trust between the participant as well as the provider. And I think the way to kind of explain this to a loved one is to tell them that, every clinical trial that's conducted in the United States today is conducted to a regulatory standard. And that regulatory standard is designed to enable you to have full disclosure about what exactly is going to happen during the clinical trial and what the process is and who is going to be watching it and making sure that everything is going according to a set of very key regulations that have been established based upon international standards. And the key in these is safety as well as transparency. And so one of the key things to also be aware of with any clinical trial is that as a participant, you can always decide in the middle of the trial that you don't want to participate anymore. That is your right as a participant in a clinical trial. And so from the perspective of, it may be hard to gain trust to participate or to explain to somebody why you're doing this, but I think if you think about this the other way, if nobody participates in a clinical trial, then we will never learn about whether or not something has a benefit.
Yes, thank you. So there's one last question. Are all participants told after the trial is over whether they got the placebo or the actual drug?
This also varies from clinical trial to clinical trial. And this will often depend on what the original design of the clinical trial is. In clinical trials that are what we call double-blinded, where neither the participant nor the provider knows what is being given, oftentimes there is an opportunity for everybody receiving the drug in the second part of the trial or as part of an open label extension. And when that transition is made, that's typically when the provider and the participant would find out about what the original treatment assignment was.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Raja. It was very informative, and I hope people will think about joining, a trial maybe when they haven't thought about it before. So thank you very much. You are our last presenter for the day, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Raja, for that informative session. It's so important for our audience to be educated on clinical trials. Dr. Raja's session on clinical trials actually wraps up our conference, day 2, and the final day of our conference. And as we come to a close, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has made this program possible. Thank you to our speakers for sharing their expertise and knowledge, certainly. And thank you to our sponsors who support everything we do in way of education, advocacy, and research. Our sponsors are argenx, Alexion, UCB, Janssen, Immunovant, Horizon Therapeutics, Regeneron, Solio Health, Catalyst, and CSI Pharmacy. Thank you to our board of directors for their continuous leadership and guidance. And thank you to our staff for their tireless work to improve the lives of those living with MG. And I want to give a special thank you to the team at NTT who works with us every time we want to bring a program to life, virtually, of course. They've been by our side these last 2 years, and we just really appreciate that team and enjoy working with them. Also, a very special thank you to Dova Levin. Dova has been the lead for this conference. She's the lead for all of our conferences, and she does an amazing job every single time. So thank you, Dova. And finally, I would like to thank all of you, our MG community members. Thank you so much for your dedication and ongoing support. It's truly appreciated. The partnership between MGFA and the community is a very special one, and together and only together will we be able to make the biggest impact. One last reminder, you can continue to access this platform for 1 year to view presentations again and to get any resources that you enjoyed and you'd like to see again. You just need to sign into this platform each time and use your password. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you a safe and happy weekend. Take care.